Is the sound better than it was yesterday? I'm going to give people another minute or two. I'm glad you guys can hear Lucy in the background. She probably wants to come inside or something. I told her she has to clear all the snow. You guys need to look at some Calvin and Hobbes for inspiration on the snowmen. Oh, Eddie, I'm not paying her. I'm only showing 25 on here right now. You guys know if anybody's having issues. We had 40 yesterday and there was no credit involved, so I was expecting a bit more today. All right, guys, it's I think it's about time that we get started. So I will go ahead and start. So just some odds and ends to begin with here. Um, First, make sure your name's on the attendance sheet so you can get credit for your assignment grade. I put them into FA Web at the end of the webcast, so people that sneak on at uh, you know 10 o'clock tonight and try to get credit are not going to get any credit. Um, One thing I forgot to mention in the last chat. One thing I forgot to mention in the last chat was the idea of Japanese internment. And to that end, I'm going to post a video today of George Takei at a TED Talk. Um, so I hope that you guys take some time to watch that. It's incredibly well done. He was actually in an internment camp. They picked him up shortly after his 4th birthday and put his family in an internment camp for the duration of the war. And he talks about his view not only of being in the internment camp and what it's like being 5 years old and excuse me, I have to go yell at my daughter. She's mad that I took her book away and she's not napping. So I'll be back in a second. All right, I'm back. That's what happens when you take a book away from a 2-year-old. So yeah, I hope you take some time over the week, watch the Takei video. It's quite well done. It's about 15 minutes long. Then another reminder: your period 7 test to be on Monday. Um, I'm guessing there is not going to be any. I'm not going to beat her. I'm guessing there's not going to be any kind of delay or anything like that. You guys are getting entirely too sassy chats at this point. So I'm working off of the assumption that my short answer Tuesday with multiple choice. uh, your open note quiz is going to go live shortly after this. I'm going to write it and post it short after the webcast, so you can look for that tonight. I'll make that due probably Monday midnight. Your vocab is also going to be posted shortly. I'm not sure on the due date on that yet. It'll probably be Friday for definitions, and then sometime in the following week for the vocab quiz. And then just an example of kind of the inspiration for the snow. Looking for a little bit more than just a pile of snow. I'm looking for the Calvin and Hobbes thought on this. Make sure it ties into APUSH somehow. Simply being a student in APUSH and taking a picture of yourself with a snowman is not enough. Your snowman has to actually be, APUSH centric, not just you. So with that stuff, does anybody have any questions? All right. Good luck to those of you in the play with the lack of practice. We're going to move into the Korean War today. And again, the Korean War ties into the post-war issues with the aftermath of World War II. After World War II, the United Nations is creating. They again kind of an offshoot of the idea behind the League of Nations, except for they were supposed to be a bit more powerful, a bit more involved. And with the United Nations, it's also important to note that the setup for it, besides getting strongly worded letters, is the Security Council oversees everything. And the Security Council has 5 permanent members. And 5 permanent members were then and are still to the United States, Great Britain, Great Britain, France, China, and then the USSR or the Soviets. Today it is Russia. So with the end of the war, our enemy shifts from fascists and Hitler and Mussolini and the Japanese military, and we shift now to our enemy being communists. Essentially, during World War II, we weren't big fans of Stalin and the Soviet Union, but one of those, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So we kind of just with each other and did our best to be cordial, to work with the common goal of eradicating the threats posed by Italy, Germany, and Japan. After the war, we are no longer friends. So the U.S. focus shifts from this idea of this idea of containing these 3 countries to now containing the spread of communism. So Truman's foreign policy and the foreign policy of essentially after him up to George H.W. Bush with the fall of the Soviet Union is the policy of containment. We will accept that there is communism where it is, but we are going to try to prevent it from spreading anyplace else. So in order to do that, we established the Marshall Plan in Europe, where we attempt to boost the countries in Europe that could be influenced by the Soviets. So we give them money, supplies, etc., to boost their economy and make sure that they don't give in to the ideas of communism. Because of this, Asia is not a huge focus, especially Southeast Asia. We recognize, obviously, if you look at a map, that Russia or the Soviets are influencing that part of the world because of the general size of the Soviet Union. But our biggest concern, our biggest trade partners are in Europe, and we want to make sure that they're protected first. So until the Korean War issues start being stirred up, we really aren't focusing all that on Southeast Asia, other than carrying out treaty agreements with the Japanese. During World War II, Korea is occupied by Japan. They had taken them over in the early 1900s. Japan had fought Russia in a war, and basically ended up with control of the Korean Peninsula. Korea was one unified country, and they both controlled. It was essentially a colony of Japan. As the war goes on, the Soviets agree to take Korea from the north. The United States takes Korea from the south, and we agree to meet at the 38th parallel. And if you look at this map, the 38th parallel is giving the United States more of Korea. It's not a 50-50 split. The reason we did that is because the Americans want to have Seoul, and Stalin's kind of in the spirit of cooperation decides, all right, we're just going to go ahead and let the Americans control the southern half of Korea. When the war is over, Koreans want unification, but the Americans and the Soviets really aren't willing to give that up. The Soviets have established a communist government in the north. The Americans are trying to push for a more democratic government in the south. And really, the Americans are largely ignoring Korea, as I said, the folks in Europe. But looking at a map, you see China very close by, you see Japan very close by. So it's important to keep that American presence in the mind of Truman on the Korean Peninsula, just so we don't have issues with Japan and others. So after the war, again, there are two separate Koreas. In the south, Syngman Rhee is set up his government. It is a Republican government in South Korea. And in the north, you have what exists today, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Kim Il-sung is the leader. This, again, is the father of Kim Jong-il, the grandfather of Kim Jong-un. So that family has been in control of Korea since the time of, since the end of World War II. North Korea wants to expand. Again, Koreans as a whole view Korea as one country. They don't want to have the two countries. So the North Koreans decide that they're going to expand. They invade South Korea on June 25th, 1950. And for that reason, this war in South Korea is sometimes referred to as the 625 War, because of the invasion on June 25th, 1950. Sorry, Jacob, for the typo. I know that's probably driving you insane. The United Nations immediately condemns the action, and they promise to do something about it. They send troops in. 8% of those troops are Americans. An interesting part of the UN makeup at this time is that, again, the Security Council nations can veto anything. So if one of those 5 countries, the United States, China, France, Great Britain, or the Soviets, if any one of those countries disagreed with the action, then they were allowed to veto it and make it not happen. So you would think, well, the Russians and Chinese, both communist countries, would probably have an issue with that. Why didn't they veto it? Russia at the time was actually boycotting the UN, so able to practice their veto, and they were boycotting the UN because there were 2 governments at that time in China, one communist and one they called it more than this government, a slightly more democratic government. The Russians felt that the Chinese representation in the UN should be the communist Chinese government. The rest of them recognized the more Taiwan-friendly part of China. So the Chinese veto was held by the side that was friendly with the Americans and the other democracies, and the Russians weren't there to veto it. So because of this, the UN is able to and do something about the North Korean invasion. The technology used in this war. This war is the first time that jet aircraft are heavily used, and the jet aircraft are going to engage in the air. So going to see the first major use of helicopters. It's largely used to evacuate medical personnel, that's the point of helicopters. That a lot of what you see in Vietnam is what you have in Korea. The U forces also have a lot of long-range bombers, and they are are going to be a major factor in the war and in creating what North Korea is today. Essentially, we go in and we destroy North Korea's infrastructure with bombs from these bombers. We destroy buildings. We destroy anything that can be used militarily against us are destroyed. Infantry weapons are basically the same stuff that's being used in World War II. This is, again, starting 5 years later. So the weapons technology doesn't advance a whole lot in terms of what the infantry and Marine troops are carrying. But the air war is more intense than what happens in World War II. And World War II was pretty intense. And forces having that technological advantage, Russia is going to step in. And this is really what makes the Cold War the Cold War. Americans never shoot at Soviets in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan in the 80s when the Russians invade. But once the other side is arming the side that they're fighting against. So that's what makes it a Cold War. It's not an out-and-out war because we never actually shoot at each other at times that that gets very close to happening, especially with nuclear weapons. But we always make sure that whoever is fighting against the other side is well armed, and we usually will share intelligence with them. In terms of costs of the war, Korea, thousands of people are going to die. And not just die during the war, but die after the war. You'll see that there's a purge in North Korea where 1 million people thought to have sympathies with South Korea are killed over a couple years. Maddie just asked how Russia levels the playing field. They provide weapons and intelligence to the North Koreans in order to kind of level the playing field technologically. Again, in Korea, property, especially in North Korea, based on those bombing runs, is going to be huge. It's going to cost them $67 billion between both sides. That would be $535 billion today. And North Korea is just essentially flattened by these bombing runs from our bombers. In terms of the United States, we're going to triple our defense budget here. Defense spending is going to be 10% of American gross national product in 1950. So we're really going to see our military grow. And this is going to lead into what's called the military industrial complex that we'll discuss later on next week. Lots of casualties for the United States in this war, and many prisoners of war. About prisoners of war later on. But the big thing you need to know about the United States here is we don't declare this a war. We don't want this to start with 3. We just want the rest of the world to think that we're just kind of stepping in to make sure that we just want to make sure that we're kind of maintaining order. This is where the Team America World Police idea kind of comes in. So Truman is very careful never to call a declared war by Congress. It's simply a police act meant to kind of keep the Russians in line. The graphic on this, just how much, I mean, you talk about World War I where the front never ever moves, and World War II where you've got island hopping and that sort of stuff where it's fought for a fairly large range. And then you look at this graphic here showing the green is the South Koreans, the red is the North Koreans, and you can see just how quickly the front in this war moved. The the initial on the North Koreans is pretty huge. The UN troops can't arrive fast enough. There's really no hope for the United States to get in that quickly into the peninsula to get up to Seoul. But what's going to happen is the North Koreans are going to make an advance, and we're essentially going to cut off their supply line. There's going to be an amphibious attack just south of the 38th parallel, where we cut off their troops, and some of them are able to get back to North Korea. Thousands are taken as prisoners of war at this point. So Seoul, the capital, is going to change hands 4 times during the war. United Nations troops are commanded by Douglas MacArthur, the American general that was heavily involved in the Pacific during World War II. And what's going to happen is our initial pushback is going to send the Koreans all the way to their northern border. You see that green line advance really, really far north after the pushdown. So in November of 1950, how far back the North Koreans are pushed. China sees that as a threat. That's China's border there in the north, and communist China does not want the United Nations kind of continuing the onslaught and heading into China. So their government is going to lend quote unquote volunteers to North Koreans to help push back that assault. Again, technologically, the North Koreans and Chinese are 8 years behind the Americans, but the Chinese just throw such a large number of troops into the battle that they're able to kind of push everything back. As the war was on, instead of a containment policy, the United States is going to say that we're following a rollback policy. So maybe that's where Walmart got their slogan. So we decided that instead of just pushing the North Koreans back to the 30th war objective, now Korea as a democratic government. We wanted it with no communism. So now our war aims have changed. Initially, we want to just kind of keep things as they were. Now we want to push forward a little bit, which is going to alarm China even further and have them send even more troops in. So as the war drags on, at the end of 1950, North Korea is going to reclaim the 38th parallel, and they're going to advance slightly south. In January of 51, the UN forces are going to push them back across 38th parallel. But essentially what's going to happen is we're going to start reaching a stalemate from 1951 to 1953. And again, this is just the UN forces have the technological advantage, but China and North Korea just have waves and waves of troops that they're able to send in order to kind of keep things as they are. And MacArthur, the one, is actually going to suggest using nuclear weapons against the Chinese. And Truman, having witnessed what nuclear weapons did in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, on top of the fact that the Soviet Union now has nuclear weapons, actually just asked MacArthur to forces him to step down and no longer lead the U.S. troops. He's just worried that the use of nukes would have escalated everything, and that would have definitely sent us into another world war. The picture, you guys, everybody's favorite is interpreting pictures. You've got someone on one side and the Americans on the other, and you can see it's a pretty good representation of exactly what the point of view was going into this war. Neither of them is actually looking at Korea. That's Uncle Sam and Stalin are just staring at each other. They're pointing at Korea. But this, in the end, is all about the United States versus the Soviets. Stalin's dead set on not giving up in Korea. He will not accept a communist defeat. So this war, this stalemate, is dragging on with no end in sight until Stalin dies in March of 1953. Then there's a power struggle that in the Soviet leadership, and Korea is just not going to be that important to them anymore. So it was no longer viewed as something the Soviets needed to influence. At the same time, Dwight Eisenhower is elected on a platform of withdrawal from North Korea. Is elected on a withdrawal platform from North Korea. So the two main combatants, even though Russia wasn't technically a combatant, the two main combatants no longer view the Korean Peninsula as a major battleground. They're willing to step down. Any questions at this point? As my chat screams in the background again. All right, Rebecca asked when Stalin dies. Stalin dies in March of 1953. Again, you're getting ahead of us, but yes, the war is technically not over. The Iron Curtain, Maddie will talk about a little bit more on future. That's essentially the Russian influence in Europe. And Lucy, the war is referred to as in North Korea. Because the North Koreans, in South Korea, because June 25th, 625 is the date that the South Koreans invaded. Mary has now joined us for our web. Say hi, Mary. As you can see, she's just as riveted as I'm sure all of you are. Sammy asked about the difference between containment and rollback. Containment meant that we just wanted to keep communism where it was. Rollback is the idea of pushing it back even further. Where the containment policy would have said, okay, we're pushing these guys back to we're pushing these guys back to the 38th parallel. Rollback says, no, we're going to push them out and reunite the Korean Peninsula. So that's the difference between containment and rollback. They like you, Mary. Scott, you're still not technically right. The Iron Curtain isn't a physical structure like the Berlin Wall was. I mean, the Berlin Wall is only part of the Iron Curtain strategy. The idea behind the Iron Curtain is how many chats do you have going, Catherine? The idea behind the Iron Curtain is Yes, that is what Austin said. It's the idea that any information about prevented from coming into Soviet-held areas. No, Scott, his argument is perfectly valid. Sorry. So, with the end of the war, there is actually no victory. Neither side really wants to admit defeat. Neither side has been defeated. We've reached the 38th parallel. That's where both sides were at the very beginning. So we don't actually sign any kind of treaty or anything. We simply sign a truce, an armistice on July 27th, 1953. So at that point, North and South Korea are divided, just as they are today. The issue happened with Kim Jong-un today are essentially the same thing that is going on in was on in Korea then. And again, here you can see there's no language saying that one side won or that the other side's going to have concessions or reparations or anything like that. We've simply suspended open hostilities. That means that they're no longer fighting. It's basically a glorified ceasefire. Military forces, they set up a 4,000 meter zone that still exists today, that creates a buffer between the two different zones, and they're going to there's actually rooms directly in the middle on the 8th parallel where they'll get together and meet, and they won't even cross like the table to their sides. It is the ultimate game of that you play with your little brother or sister in the car, where you have to stay on one side or the other. They're also going to prisoners of war, which we'll talk about in a second. That's an incredibly complicated thing. When neither side loses, POWs are bargaining chips. So it's very complicated giving them up. Plus, you're going to run into the idea of people wanting to return to the side that they came from. And then they establish a commission just of a couple countries to make sure that all the terms are followed. So here are lines showing your demilitarized zone. You also have the North Korea. Their waterways are restricted. They can only in the sea, and I mean this is when we hear about North Korea in the news breaking the armistice or fighting with South Korea again. Usually what they're doing is literally lobbing missiles over that imaginary line in the ocean. And they're just kind of blowing up water, but it's just posturing on the part of the North Koreans. Here is just some imagery of the 38th parallel. Again, it kind of funny, but the demilitarized zone is anything but demilitarized. There's a heavy military presence there to make sure that nobody's doing anything wrong, that nobody's shooting over top of it, or anything like that. All right, so prisoners of war. Prisoners of war, again, nobody really wins in this conflict. So usually prisoners of war, the terms for releasing them made in the treaty negotiations, usually dictated by victors. In this case, nobody won, so what do we do? So the first thing he does is set up a committee of neutral countries to decide what to do. So you can see the 5 countries there: Czechoslovakia, India, Poland, Sweden, and Switzerland, who's always neutral, are on this commission, and it's their job to oversee the entire process, to create what that process is going to be, and then give an idea of what's happening as it's going on. Many of the Chinese and North Korean prisoners of war are actually kind of happy being prisoners of war on the Democratic side of the line. A lot of them were forced into the army by their communist governments, and they're just not happy being forced to return. So it's decided they could choose their own fate. They could stay in captivity, be repatriated somewhere else, or return to their homeland. Many of them decide not to return to their homeland. In 1953, almost 90,000 prisoners of war end up being exchanged. It's kind of a massive trade-off. And the repatriation commission ends up taking custody of those prisoners of war to make just to make things easier. So that way the North Koreans couldn't claim that the Americans and the United Nations were holding on to their prisoners. They could simply say, no, they're being held by these neutral countries, and the neutral countries will decide what to do with them from there. So the fallout from this war. First off, the biggest thing in this, and this is going to happen to our returning troops from Vietnam as well. The only differences with Vietnam were openly hostile to returning troops. This is called the Forgotten War. And about it, like it's basically, it happens right after World War II, which is a big war. It happens shortly before Vietnam, which is an incredibly controversial war that we still talk about today. And Korea now, in the eyes of states in 2015, and even into the States, and even when the war is going on, Korea is a faraway land that makes no sense to them. So, so it's simply just forgotten in the United States. In China and North Korea, it's called a war of American aggression on North Korea. And with Korea, it's viewed as an invasion. They call it the 625 War because that's the date that they were invaded. We sign a mutual defense treaty with South Korea, basically meaning if either nation is attacked, then we've got each other's back. Obviously, that's mostly going toward if North Korea invades the South, then we're going to, excuse me, step in on behalf of South Korea. In South Korea, there is a massive recession after, and the 50s are not a good decade for them. The 50s are not a good decade really anywhere in the world outside of the United States. But they're going to bounce back strong. When the war ends, they're actually beneath Ghana economically. Today, they're the 13th most powerful economy in the world, and Ghana's ranked like 85th. So they're going to make huge strides to rebound. In North Korea, the aftermath of the war is, I mean, you guys are largely familiar with this. It's tragic, really. Most of their infrastructure is destroyed during the war, and we aren't able to help them to rebuild that because they refuse help from pretty much anybody except for communist countries. 1 million people are going to be what's called purged by the government. Basically, if they are viewed to have any kind of anti-government sentiment, then there's large concentration camps, forced labor camps, where millions of people are sent to die. There is incredibly widespread famine, still ongoing today. Most people in North Korea are go hungry on a daily basis. The only country really cooperative with North Korea now is China, and even the Chinese report that your average North Korean is 5 inches shorter than your average Chinese citizen, and all of that traces to malnutrition. So also, North Korea, you guys know today, if you ever see the shot from space of Southeast Asia at night, very little electricity. Pyongyang, the capital, is fairly online electrically, but the rest of the country just isn't. In China, Mao Zedong is the communist leader in China. He is going to be bolstered this because he is basically going to claim that he defeated the Americans and pushed back the invading American army. So he's going to get a stronger grip on China and a more prominent place in the world because of this. In response to that, the United States is going to strengthen their relationship with Taiwan. Taiwan south of China, and very concerned with the communist government in China. So the United States greatly going to step in and be a major ally of Taiwan. In China, and they teach this as a war of American aggression. So there's strong anti-American sentiments. Those have largely died off in China since we've become a trading partner. But in North Korea, their citizens are still taught that the United States is the bad guy. We respond to that by interview came out. Some Americans actually sent weather balloons over North Korea and dropped copies of the interview into the country. We also will occasionally drop leaflets and those sorts of things into North Korea, just because they're completely shut off from the rest of the world. They don't get information. There is no internet in North Korea, so this is our way to speak with them. And lastly, that was never resolved. So there's a lot of tensions that are ongoing even today in Korea. Normally, when you hear problems there, it's the North that's trying to posture and seem more important to the South. Like I said, they'll occasionally just lob some missiles into the ocean, or they frequently, in 2013, they threatened a nuclear attack on the United States to the point that we actually sent some missile defenses to Guam because they were threatening Guam, they were threatening the Philippines. We're pretty sure they don't actually have nuclear technology, weaponized nuclear technology. They do have the capability for nuclear power, but it's something we still watch very closely today. And as much as people like to laugh at the idea of Kim Jong-il from Team America World Police, Jong-un, and his friendship with Dennis Rodman and those sorts of people, it is still a if they ever got any kind of power, if Kim Jong-un ever got any real military might, they could pose a significant threat in the world today, especially since Russia seems to be going back to being more of an enemy than a friend of the United States. So that's the Korean War and its aftermath. Again, we'll look after your test more at the domestic happenings in the 50s. AP seems focused on what happens in the 60s. The Korean War and the Vietnam War are mentioned by name in the curriculum framework, which means that well, you don't need to know specific battles or anything like that. You need to know the general kind of concepts that caused the war and the overarching ideas surrounding it. So at this point, any questions about the Korean War? Scott asked, how is Russia becoming bad again? What is Putin doing? If you saw the news over the weekend, he just killed his one of his primary opponents. It's not the first time that he's done it, and he's kind of constantly there. Maddie asked about Black Hawk Down and Behind Enemy Lines. Neither are about Korea. MASH is about the Korean War, the TV show and movie. Black Hawk Down, I believe, is about our intervention in Somalia. I'm not sure about Behind Enemy Lines. Darius, I go over what's happening next week one more time. I'll revisit that when we get to the end of the question. Lucy asked about major repercussions of having Mao Zedong control China. China becomes a communist country. They still are today. Essentially, the nationalists are defeated in China, and communism takes control. They have a weird relationship with Russia. You would expect two communist countries to get along better than they actually do. It's kind of two different types of communism. So, so they aren't going to be. How do I put this? They're not going to be as strong of allies as you would expect them to be. But China is going to grow into a world power, and they are a world communist power that's still being dealt with today. Jen asked about common themes for the first New Deal versus the second New Deal. The big thing that you need to know there, Jen, is it's not really what FDR couldn't get past the first time. The second New Deal is a response to the Supreme Court striking down large portions of the first New Deal. And it's also a response to the radicals and union leaders pushing him to do a little bit more. So the first New Deal, Supreme Court declares some of it unconstitutional, and labor unions and others are not happy with it and they want more. Thus, you get a second New Deal. Scott asked about the impact on China after the Korean War. The Korean War is the whole reason that China becomes communist. They very much rally around it. They use the Korean War as a rally against the West, against the United States. So yes, there's a huge impact in China. All right, I'll go ahead and address Darius's question. If you have any other questions, go ahead and keep firing away. Just a review of next week. Today, your chapter or whatever it is quiz is going to go live. I'm going to write it shortly after we finish up here. Monday, short answer question test. Tuesday, multiple choice test. At the end of next week, you've got another open note quiz that will again be done at home. You also have Zinn questions due at the end of next week. You'll also have vocab. I'll probably make that due Friday. Getting posted shortly, probably by the end of the weekend. So probably by Friday, the vocab will be due, and then we'll do the vocab quiz in class the following week. You also have the LBJ outline to look forward to. Scott, now it's still a kind of point of pride that the Chinese were able to defeat the Americans. I guess would be my response there. Matt, I will be sure to take care of the shrubs for you. You guys send me some snowman pictures. And for something more creative than plow banks and 3-inch pile of snow with a lighter on top. Any other questions out there? We are doing the civil rights is exactly that. JFK, while he's a very famous president, has a relatively short-lived presidency. I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis does happen, but really, the College Board, one of their focuses with Period 8 is the spread of liberalism, and LBJ outlines the Great Society and kind of gets the ball rolling with a lot of the social programs that are going today. And then the next focus of the College Board is kind of the conservative response to that happens during the Reagan years. So that's why we do the LBJ outline instead of JFK. Obviously, still need to know JFK, Cuban Missile Crisis, all that fun stuff. But LBJ is specifically mentioned in the curriculum framework. Thus, you have to do a major outline for LBJ and just one of the basic outlines for JFK. Kat, yes, I have seen Annie. I'm gonna go ahead and switch off the broadcast here, and I'll just answer questions in chat from this point forward.